Now, question 3 is a 6-mark question, and we move on to assessment objectives. This is now assessing assessment objective 2, and that's explain and comment on and analyse how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers using relevant subject terminology to support their views. Okay, the key to marking as markers and the key for students in terms of answering this question is to understand that requirement to include both language and structure as part of the answer. And answers that don't include both will restrict the range that they can do. Okay, so if I can take the actual mark scheme itself, says that there should be sufficient evidence analysing both language and structure. Responses that are unbalanced cannot access level 2 or above, where analysis of both language and structure is required. Now, it's not necessary to have an equal balance between language and structure, but an answer that only contains one of those two features can't get beyond 2 marks, which is level 1. Okay, let's have a look at some examples, shall we? So the question asks, in lines 19 to 37, how does the writer use language and structure to show George's feelings about the war? Okay, this question makes a prompt start, where the opening, the writer uses a tricolon of positive emotions to show that George is very excited about going to war. It's worth saying that this is a 6-mark question. There is no need to include an introduction, there's no need to include a conclusion, so answers that begin by directly addressing the question will make much better use of their time, and we'll have more time later. Okay, so this is a strong opening, this is a structure point about tricolon of positive emotions. We then look at the triadic structure reinforces the feelings of happiness, and then this candidate includes a supporting quotation, fierce excitement of doubt and hope and pleasure, and then moves on to talk about connotations. This is a strong point about structure, well supported and very clearly made. So as a marker, I'm now looking to see whether this student's also going to include points about language. It moves on to say, also the writer uses a positive adverb of fierce to describe how George is ready to go out and fight. So I can see that we're now moving on to address features of language, that we have supporting quotation from that, and that this is clearly moved out of level 1, that the quality of the commentary that we have here really is of level 3 standard. The final point that it makes, let's turn over this candidate's use some additional page, which is about, furthermore, the writer repeatedly uses exclamatory sentences to express George's feelings of wanting to deploy for war, because this is what you would use in that circumstance. So there's a further structure point, not support there. This script was given a mark of 5. It clearly has both language and structure. It's clearly well supported, and it shows a good insight into the paper. I think a quotation for the final point would have been the final thing to move it up to that 6, but this is a strong level 3 response. Okay, let's have a look at script 2. Right, script 2 is also awarded 5 marks. This is another level 3 script, and also has that same feature of good practice, that it makes a crisp, succinct opening. The writer successfully uses language and structure to show George's excitement about war. So we've identified one of the thoughts and feelings, particularly shown through repeated use of exclamatory sentences in lines 19 to 20. This is a point about structure, which effectively shows the fierce excitement George feels. So actually, this is a deepening sense of what that feeling is, that George feels about war despite the tremendous hazards. The word hazards, so here we can see that we now move on to address a point about language, connotes danger, which is emphasised by the adjective tremendous. So as you can see, the quality of the language comment, the ability for language and structure to actually identify apt, well-chosen support is what's defining this as a level 3 answer. So the use of tremendous implies that George is an extremely skilled captain in the army, for him not to be fearful of what's to come. Furthermore, the excitement is reinforced by the rhetorical question, so we have further structure points at the end and identification of where they come from, and perhaps here a hero through the word valour, so we get a final, less well made, but a final point about language. So there's a good balance of language and structure, well supported, shows insight. For those who are worried about George's excitement, the technical accuracy, this is a test of reading. Technical accuracy will be dealt with in section B, so that's not a concern here. This is about reading insight. Okay, let's have a look at script 3. Okay, on script 3, we come down a level. This is a script that was awarded 3 marks, so that puts it in level 2. Okay, as we can see, in lines 19 to 37, George shows thoughts and feelings about war by using references to simple things that can be won. And then we have a particularly long quotation. Now, one of the features of better answers is that they're able to select quotations with some degree of precision and also not spend too much of the answer copying sections from the text. But this is a long quotation which lacks focus. However, it does support what's being said about simple things, and this shows that George is used to winning and that the war would be easy. It's not a very well explained point, but it is a point about language. In addition, George is shown to be active and excited as the quote, as the simple sentences reinforce. He's in a rush that he can't wait to get going to the war, and it identifies some line references where those simple sentences come from. So we do have language and structure. We don't have the same strength of explanation. We don't have the same quality of textual references, which is why it comes down into level 2, but this scores 3 marks as a level 2 answer. Okay, let's move on to script 4. Script 4 is also a level 2 script, also awarded 3 marks. Now, as you can see on this one, actually, the first 4 lines of the answer here are taken up by the student simply repeating the words of the question. That's not necessary, there are no marks available there, and in terms of the time available and the best use of time, students are much better if they simply begin by making their first point. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So this answer actually begins in paragraph 2. One way he shows his thoughts is in line 24. We have the quotation about the cricket match, and that shows that he's fairly confident about going into the war, and that the word dallying shows that he's trying to waste time in a careless or unserious manner. Well, actually, the first point about confident isn't particularly shown. Excited, enthusiastic, but also relatively experienced. But the point about dallying, that he's wasting time in a careless and unserious manner, that is largely lifted from the glossary at the end, but is a valid point about language. Although it shows he's not scared for the war, indicating that he's been there before, there's no evidence from the text to suggest that. So this is a language point, albeit not a particularly strong one at the moment. Okay, so again, as marker, you're looking to see whether we get a structure point to move out of level 1. So on the additional page, we have the writer includes structure by using rhetorical questions. What were all the games of chance he'd ever played? So here's a good point. Here's the appropriate support for it. And then he answers these questions himself as he talks about his boyhood. So this one does something slightly more with the structure point. Now, there was some discussion about this one. This one largely does sit on that 2-3 mark borderline, but because it includes language and structure, because there is support, it was moved over into level 2 and given a mark of 3. I draw your attention to the final paragraph, where, as you can see, and actually the student should have noticed, as they've written in line 15, he's bounding down the stairs, showing that he's proud to fight for his country. Now, this is outside the selected line references for this question, and the student knows that. They've quoted a line reference that is outside, so there's no credit given for that final paragraph at all, and it's one thing that students need to be aware of as they're doing this one. Okay, finally, let's come to script 5. Okay, script 5 is a level 1 script. It was given 2 marks. Let's see what we have. Again, we have the first paragraph, which is simply a repetition of the question, which scores no marks for the candidate. This candidate begins by talking about the use of structure through rhetorical questions, what were all the games of chance, but the explanation is that George is confused about war, doesn't really know fully about it, so he knows what he thinks that he's been told. This could also be portraying the point that he doesn't know what to think, that he feels as if he should be asking questions, but no answer is coming from it. So it does identify a rhetorical question, it does identify that structure point, but it's less clear. Now we move on to talking about emotive verbs. If I just move on to the final section of this answer, where the candidate chooses to focus upon the word dallying as their choice of emotive verb, to show how reluctant George is and how that he's not ready to go yet, and that he's procrastinating, and he wants to stall for however long before he goes to war. Well, actually, we know that's not the case at all, that actually that's a misreading of the passage. So this is an answer that has structure, but it has no language. We can't credit that as a language point. And for that reason, this one stays in level 1 and was given a mark of 2. Okay, let's move on to question 4. Question 4 is worth 15 marks. That's more than questions 1, 2 and 3 put together. And therefore, one of the important things to say to students is that you must ensure that you allocate sufficient time to question 4 in order really to produce a depth of answer that's going to give you access to those higher mark levels. Okay, we're also moving on in terms of assessment objectives. Question 4 tests assessment objective 4, which is to evaluate text critically and support this with appropriate textual references. Okay, the key word here is evaluate. Okay, this is not an AO2 question, if you like, the difference between how something is done and how well something is done. So an evaluation question is asking you for a judgment about how well the writer has achieved whatever the question is focusing on. And that's the important thing for students to include in their answer, to make sure that they do. So therefore, you need some evaluative language in your answer to signpost to an examiner that that's what you're doing. Alongside that, obviously, you also need the textual references to support the points that you're making, so that you're showing a deep and insightful understanding of the passage. In terms of the mark scheme, that's very clear in the mark scheme that the mark scheme recognises that reference to writer's techniques should only be credited at level 2 and above if they support the critical judgment of the text. So it's very clear to markers that what's being looked for here is evaluation, and if the answer is only one about technique, it will restrict the range of marks that are available to you. Now the mark scheme contains some helpful indicative content about whichever particular passage has been selected, but I would draw your attention to the mark table itself, where you can see that there are 5 levels of marks available, 3 marks within each level, and I think this is useful for students as well as markers, is to look at that hierarchy of skills which is being looked for in this question. So in level 1, this is about description and limited assertion. Level 2 is about comment and straightforward opinion. By level 3, we're looking for explanation and informed judgment. Level 4 is about analysis and well-informed and developed critical judgment. And level 5 is the evaluation of ideas, sustained and detached critical overview. So you can see that there's a clear hierarchy of skills that are being looked for in response to this question. So, and that's why 15 marks. Most important thing is make sure that you judge your time accordingly so that you give this the correct amount of time. Shall we look at some answers? Okay, question 4, script 1. Okay, question 4, script 1 is, let's begin with a top mark answer. School's always asking, what does a top mark answer look like? And it looks like this. This is a very strong answer. So let's see, keep one eye on that mark scheme whilst we look at this particular answer. So it begins with, again, look at the way that this answer begins. The writer effectively contains an emotive tone throughout the text. in order to successfully show the different responses of men and women in war. This answer says something in its very first sentence. It's making reference to language features and it's making an evaluative comment about that. It moves on in the opening lines about a theme of helplessness, and as you can see in the middle of that paragraph, there's strong and well-chosen textual support about the way that women are powerless to stop men. This answer knows from the very beginning the way that it's going to structure its response about the different views of war by the two different genders. Okay, then we're going to have a contrasting point here that powerfully contrasted by George's comparison of war to the games of chance. So we have evaluation, we have commentary, we have support. That tone that we talked about, the emotive tone from the beginning, is picked up here with about the enthusiastic tone used throughout the second half of the extract and how this is sustained. I'm not going to go through every sort of thing, but what you can see here very clearly is, and what we often say to markers is, you don't have to wait till the end of reading a longer answer like this before you decide the quality of what you're looking at. So by now, this student is already doing more than simply describing or commenting or explaining. That this is already looking to move into levels 4 and 5, and really as a marker what you're looking to see is whether this sustains, improves and sustains the standard that it's set out with, and in this particular case it does. Okay, we can point out a few more features of this answer, this paragraph on the bottom here, where actually a very subtle point that's made here about the gallant sight of the soldiers as they march off on the surface, but that beneath that, the bravery and the valour, that the frightened, anxious feeling reflecting the different responses that the people have. In its final page, this answer really does go into a different territory in terms of looking at the different cultural responses to war. Now, as we say, this answer receives 15 marks. It really does more than is necessary to receive that top mark. But this point here in the final paragraph about the long-held cultural values and effective way of presenting that men want to fight and participate in war, whereas women feel disempowered by that. So we end up with this final interpretation of that difference. And if you remember back to the opening paragraph of this answer where it said that it was going to look at the gender differences of men and women, and it sustains that throughout. So if you want to look at the mark scheme there, evaluation of ideas, events, themes, we very definitely have. Is it sustained? Yes, it's very strongly sustained throughout. This answer doesn't have an off point. It sustains the quality throughout, and that there is a strong and apt selection of textual references at every point through. So this is a particularly strong answer, and it's not a surprise that it receives full marks. Okay, let's have a look at another strong answer which was also awarded a mark in level 5. In the beginning we have Amelia presented as despair-stricken, haunted. George, with his pangs of guilt, conveys the idea that her pain is such a heavy emotion it affects him strongly too. Strong opening. That final comment about the heavy emotion lacked a little bit of precision. But after that point, this answer continues to improve after that. So what do we get? We get a comment about the silence. Amelia is clearly shown as if she's going to miss her husband greatly, that she follows him around, she's taken up the sash. Notice as we go through the range of evaluative comments that you see here, this effectively shows even her husband's faced with tremendous hazards, that she won't ruin his eagerness and his excitement. So there's an interpretation here as to why she is silent, that it's not simply that she's distraught, that actually it's that she can tell the level of excitement that he feels about going to war, and that she won't spoil that. Okay, over the page we have the conflicting emotions, and that she's going to allow him to do something that he enjoys, even if he may die as a result of that. Moving on, I think a particularly good point here about we have the great game of war. This nonchalant attitude to war effectively creates the impression that he's confident because we know that he's won 100 triumphs. Notice the way that this answer manages to integrate those quotations into quite a seamless commentary as it goes through. Okay, as we know, and there's a strong comment at the beginning of the next paragraph about George being solely focused on admiration, more focused on that than he is on his wife's misery. And then this comment about dallying and the fact that he sees his spending time in his wife's embrace as a waste of time is a subtle one that's well made. So as you can see, this answer, after that very brief lack of precision at the beginning, has picked up quality and is very clearly, once again, if you're looking at those levels, is in the top levels of the mark scheme. As I say, we come towards the end, the way that George jumps away from the gentle arms swiftly to the regiment. He chooses danger over his wife's gentleness. He's being effectively presented as a man of war, which is a nice abstraction of that gender role that we see. Finally, as we come to the end, we can see George shown to almost crave the admiration he gets from women and men for his bravery and the military valour. This is a strong concluding point. So this is a sustained response. It has an excellent range of textual references seen throughout. There's clear and often quite a subtle reading of the text, and this one was awarded a mid level 5 response and given a mark of 14. Okay, let's move on to script 3. Script 3 brings us down into level 4. This is much more of a borderline 3-4 response. It makes less of a successful, succinct start. We have to wait for the point about, throughout the extract, George's positive feelings about the war. And then we get the quotation. So we do have point and support here. The fact that the great game is there to be played and that George is relieved and excited, and that this powerfully shows his anticipation to get to war. So, as I say, you need to look for some of these evaluative phrases as you're going through the answers. It continues to improve from there. The comment about symbolism, again, is a particularly good one you're far less likely to see in those lower levels of the mark scheme. That the sash that she's carrying with the heavy net of crimson symbolises her fears about George going to war is a good point, with some evaluation at the bottom of that page. Less detail to this answer, as we can see as we come over. We have the point about her trying to stay strong, the interpretation of why she acts in the way that she does. And George's excitement towards the war is clear, that he has a fierce excitement, which is emphasised as he goes off with his friends, his eagerness and excitement. So, there are some elements of analysis, some elements of explanation. There is a range of textual references. It doesn't start as strongly as others. The discussion here was around that borderline between level 3 and level 4, and it was finally given a mark of 10. Felt that particularly that point about symbolism was a particularly good one that tipped it into level 4. We're given a mark of 10. Okay, let's moving down the available range of marks. We'll look at script 4. Script 4 scores 4 and is in level 2. As you can see with the opening, the writer has successfully shown the different ways that people respond to war. Is simply a representation of the wording of the question itself, that there's no real comment there. One way shown in the second line, inexpressible pangs, shows it's a hard time and it's painful emotions. So I think what we can see here is we have the comment, but we don't have the explanation. Why is this a level 2 and not a level 3? Is because it lacks that quality of explanation. Another way people may respond to war is it's powerless, and they keep their loved ones at home as they're forced to fight. And you turn over expecting there to be more to the answer. This answer, leaving aside that representation of the question, is essentially just those 2 paragraphs. Another unusual thing about this answer is that the comments don't identify specific characters. They talk about another way people may respond to war, so it lacks that precision. But there are 2 distinct comments. Those 2 comments are supported, which is why it makes its way just into level 2 rather than being lower. Okay, so that one was given a mark of 4. And if we finish with script 5, script 5, as you can see, a much shorter script. I mean, for those last 2, going back to what we said at the beginning about an effective use of time across the paper for 15 marks, actually this student needed to have spent more time and to give a more extended and considered answer to question 4. So what do we have? We have, again, the writer successfully shows a difference in different ways. The opening 2 lines lack any precision, really repackage some of the wording in the question. As you can see, Emma reacts in an upset way, quoting pangs, and she yells, it's unfair and it shouldn't be a thing, that George is confused. So there's some use of textual reference here. There's some use of comment about the text, but there's also misunderstanding, that's saying that George is confused, he doesn't know what to think about war, and that's not the case at all. George isn't confused. George has a very clear view about his excitement. So this has elements of, at that beginning of the longer paragraph, you may have thought that you were looking at a level 2 answer, but the misunderstanding comes in as we go through that paragraph, meaning that the decision was taken to move this back over that threshold into level 1 and was given a mark of 3. Okay, so that concludes section A. Section A, as we said, tests reading. We're now going to go on and look at section B, which is the writing section.